This 1916 portrait of a tutor and boy looks innocent until you notice the stamp. At first glance, it seemed like nothing more than a charming relic of progressive-era education, a young student, a dedicated mentor, the trappings of privilege and promise. But one detail refused to stay quiet, and what it revealed would pull a Chicago archivist into a system so meticulously hidden that it operated for decades in plain sight. Margaret Chen had been cataloging photographs for the Lakewood Historical Society for 11 years. The nonprofit occupied 3 floors of a converted warehouse on the city's north side, and its collection sprawled across every decade from the 1840s to the present. Most of the work was routine: logging, tagging, digitizing, the occasional donor visit to accept another box of attic debris that someone's grandmother had left behind. But the Whitmore estate donation was different from the start. The Whitmores had been one of Chicago's wealthiest families during the Gilded Age and into the early 20th century. Banking, railroads, meatpacking. Their name appeared on hospital wings and university libraries. When the last direct heir died childless in 2019, the estate's contents were dispersed to institutions across the city. The Historical Society received 17 boxes of photographs, letters, and household papers. Margaret was assigned to process them alone. The portrait came from Box 9. It was mounted on heavy cardboard stock with gilded edges, the kind of formal presentation piece wealthy families commission to commemorate important occasions. In it, a boy of perhaps 10 or 11 sat in an ornate leather chair in what appeared to be a private library. Dark wood shelves lined the walls behind him, filled with matching volumes. To his left stood a young man in his 20s, dressed in the understated attire of a professional educator, a dark suit, wire-rimmed spectacles. One hand rested lightly on the boy's shoulder, the other held a leather-bound book, angled downward as though he had just been reading aloud. The handwritten caption on the back read, "Young Master Harold with Mr. Eames, his tutor, September 1916. Margaret almost set it aside. It was a beautiful image, well preserved, but hardly unusual for a family of this stature. Private tutors were common among the wealthy before boarding school age. She had seen dozens of similar portraits, but something made her pause. She lifted the photograph closer to the window. The light caught the surface of the book in the tutor's hand at a different angle, and she saw it. There, on the underside of the leather cover, barely visible unless you knew to look, was a faint embossing. Not the decorative tooling of a fine binding, something stamped, institutional. She carried the photograph to her workstation and positioned it under the magnifier. The embossing came into focus slowly, letter by letter. Property of the Illinois State Orphanage, Springfield, 1904. Margaret sat back. The book was not from the Whitmore family library. It had come from a state orphanage 12 years before this portrait was taken. She looked at the young man holding it. Mr. Eames, the tutor. Why would a private tutor in one of Chicago's wealthiest households be holding a book stamped as property of a state orphanage? It was possible there was an innocent explanation: donated books, surplus sales. But something about the image now felt different. The tutor's hand on the boy's shoulder. The way Harold Whitmore sat so still, so composed, as though he had been arranged rather than captured. Margaret turned the photograph over again and studied the caption. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate. But she noticed something she had missed before. Below the main inscription, in pencil so faint it was nearly invisible, someone had written a single word: returned. Margaret Chen had built her career on patience. She was not prone to dramatic conclusions, but as she sat in the fading afternoon light, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. This photograph was not what it appeared to be, and the answer, whatever it was, had been waiting over a century for someone to ask the right questions. She photographed the embossing at maximum resolution and saved the file to a folder she labeled simply Whitmore Anomaly. She did not yet know that this folder would grow to contain over 400 documents before she was finished, or that the story behind this single portrait would implicate one of Chicago's most respected institutions in a system of child exploitation that operated under the language of education and charity. The next morning, Margaret began with the obvious lead. The Illinois State Orphanage in Springfield had been one of the largest child welfare institutions in the Midwest during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It opened in 1865 initially to house children orphaned by the Civil War and expanded steadily in the decades that followed. By 1900, it held over 600 children at any given time. She found the institution referenced in several historical databases, but detailed records were harder to locate. A fire in 1923 had destroyed the main administrative building, and with it, much of the orphanage's early documentation. What survived was scattered across multiple archives. Some intake ledgers had been transferred to the Illinois State Archives. A collection of photographs and annual reports was held by a historical society in Springfield. But the discharge records, the documents that would show what happened to children after they left, were largely missing. Margaret noted this gap but pressed forward. She needed to identify Mr. Eames and understand his connection to the orphanage. She returned to the Whitmore family papers and worked through them systematically, box by box, folder by folder. In Box 12, she found a household ledger from 1914 through 1918. It listed monthly expenses in neat columns: groceries, coal, staff wages, clothing, medical, education. Under education, she found regular payments to a man named Theodore Eames. The amounts were consistent with a tutor's salary of the period, but there was something strange about the entries. They were listed not under salary, but under placement maintenance. She had never seen that phrase in any household record before. 2 days later, Margaret contacted Dr. Leonard Okafor, a historian at Northwestern University whose research focused on child welfare policy in the Progressive Era. She had attended one of his lectures years earlier and remembered his detailed knowledge of institutional practices. She emailed him the photograph and the ledger entries and asked if the phrasing meant anything to him. His reply came within hours. "This is extremely interesting. Can we meet?" They sat in his office the following week, the photograph projected on a screen behind his desk. Dr. Okafor was in his early 60s, with a quiet intensity that Margaret found reassuring. He had spent 20 years studying how Progressive-era reformers had reshaped child welfare, often with unintended consequences. "Placement maintenance," he said, tapping the phrase on the ledger copy Margaret had brought. "This is language from the indenture system, or more accurately, from what replaced it." He explained that throughout the 19th century, orphanages routinely placed out children with families who agreed to provide room, board, and education in exchange for the child's labor. This was often presented as a benevolent arrangement, a chance for orphans to learn trades and join respectable households. In practice, it frequently amounted to unpaid domestic servitude. Children as young as 7 were sent to work as farmhands, kitchen help, or nursemaids. Some were treated well, many were not. By the 1890s, reformers had begun pushing for oversight. New laws required contracts, inspections, and proof that children were actually being educated. Orphanages developed formal placement programs that supposedly monitored children's welfare. Placement maintenance was the fee families paid to the orphanage to cover administrative costs, theoretically ensuring that someone was checking on the child's treatment. But here's the problem, Dr. Okafor said. The system was built on paperwork. If you controlled the paperwork, you controlled the narrative, and wealthy families had enormous influence over these institutions. They sat on boards, they donated buildings, they shaped policy. Margaret looked at the photograph again, the tutor's hand on Harold Whitmore's shoulder, the orphanage book still in his grip. "You think Mr. Eames was not a tutor," she said. Dr. Okafor shook his head slowly. "I think Mr. Eames may have been a placement, a child from the orphanage sent to the Whitmore household under an education contract that existed mostly on paper. And I think by 1916, he had been there long enough to be presented as something else entirely." The theory was disturbing, but it did not yet constitute proof. Margaret needed to find Theodore Eames in the orphanage records. She traveled to Springfield the following month. The state archives occupied a modern building on the edge of downtown, climate-controlled and fluorescent lit. A staff archivist helped her locate the surviving intake ledgers from the Illinois State Orphanage, a set of oversized volumes covering roughly 1880 to 1910. The records were alphabetical by year of intake. Margaret started with 1900 and worked backward. In the 1898 volume, she found him, Theodore Eames, admitted March 14, 1898 at age 6, mother deceased, father unknown, no relatives listed, assigned to the boys' dormitory, Ward C. The intake record included a physical description: brown hair, hazel eyes, small for his age, no distinguishing marks. Under disposition, someone had written in a different hand, placed June 1904, contract 7743. Margaret asked the archivist about contract records. He checked the catalog and returned with bad news. The contract files had been stored in the administrative building. They were among the records destroyed in the 1923 fire. But something else survived. The orphanage had published annual reports for its board of trustees, and the archives held a nearly complete run from 1875 to 1920. Margaret requested the 1904 and 1905 volumes. The reports were dense with statistics: admissions, discharges, deaths, runaways, tables showing how many children had been placed in good Christian homes and how many had been returned for various reasons. The language was optimistic, emphasizing the institution's mission to rescue children from poverty and vice and transform them into productive citizens. In the 1904 report, Margaret found a section titled Educational Placements. It described a new program launched that year in which children of exceptional promise were placed with families of means and culture who agreed to provide advanced education in exchange for the child's assistance with household duties. The report emphasized that these placements were carefully supervised and that children received regular instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and moral character. The 1905 report contained a list of families participating in the program. The Whitmores were not named directly, but there was a reference to a prominent Chicago banking family who had accepted a placement and reported excellent progress. Margaret photographed every page. She was beginning to see the outline of a system. Wealthy families acquired children from state orphanages under the guise of educational charity. The children were presented as students or wards. In reality, they were servants, their labor disguised as assistants, their presence in the household explained by contracts that no one was likely to question. But she still did not understand the photograph. If Theodore Eames had been placed with the Whitmores, in 1904, he would have been 12 years old. By 1916, he would have been 24, old enough to be presented as an adult employee, a tutor. Had he been kept in the household that long, had he transitioned from child servant to adult staff? Or had the Whitmores simply continued the fiction, calling him a tutor while he remained in the same subordinate role he had occupied since childhood? And what about the boy in the photograph? Harold Whitmore. The caption called him Young Master. But Margaret had not yet found any record of a Harold Whitmore in the family genealogy she had reviewed. She returned to the Whitmore papers with new focus. In box 14, she found a bundle of correspondence between Edith Whitmore, the matriarch of the household, and her sister in New York. The letters spanned 1910 to 1919 and covered the usual topics of wealthy women's lives: travel, health, social engagements, household management. In a letter dated August 1916, 1 month before the portrait was taken, Edith wrote, "The new boy is settling in nicely. Mr. Eames has been invaluable in helping him adjust. He remembers so well what it was like to arrive here as a child himself." Margaret read the sentence 3 times. The new boy. Arrive here as a child himself. She searched the rest of the correspondence for any mention of Harold. In October 1916, Edith wrote, "Harold is proving bright but willful. Mr. Eames believes structure is the answer. We have commissioned a portrait to mark his progress." In December 1916, Harold has been returned to Springfield. The arrangement was not suitable. It is a disappointment, but Mr. Eames assures me the next placement will be better matched. Returned. The word penciled on the back of the photograph. Margaret sat in the archive reading room for a long time, the letter in her hands. The portrait was not a celebration of education. It was documentation, a record of a transaction. Harold had been a placement child, acquired from the same orphanage that had supplied Theodore Eames 12 years earlier. The portrait was taken to show the family's investment to demonstrate that the arrangement was working. And when it did not work, when Harold proved willful, he was sent back. But what happened to children who were returned? And how many had there been? The Springfield Historical Society held a small collection of photographs from the orphanage, mostly formal group portraits taken for annual reports. Margaret requested access and spent 2 days examining them. The images showed rows of children in identical clothing, standing in front of institutional buildings, faces blank, posture rigid. In several photographs, individual children were marked with small numbers inked onto the print, corresponding to a legend on the back that listed names and placement status. In a photograph from 1910, Margaret found a boy marked with the number 7743, the same number as Theodore Eames's placement contract. But the boy in the photograph was not Theodore. He was younger, perhaps 8 or 9. The legend identified him as Walter R., placed 1910, contract 7743 reassigned. Margaret felt a chill. The contract numbers were being reused. When a placement ended, whether through the child aging out, being returned, or simply disappearing, the same number was assigned to a new child. This meant the placement records, even if they had survived the fire, would be almost impossible to reconstruct. A single contract number might represent 3, 4, or 5 different children over the years. The paperwork was designed to obscure, not to document. She contacted Dr. Okafor with her findings. He was not surprised. This was standard practice at many institutions, he told her over the phone. The contract system was meant to look rigorous, but it was actually a mechanism for deniability. If a child was abused, ran away, or died, the orphanage could claim they had no record of that specific placement. The numbers protected the institution and the families. They erased the children. Margaret asked if there was any way to find out what had happened to the children who were returned or whose placements ended badly. Sometimes, Dr. Okafor said, death records, hospital admissions, police reports, but you have to know where to look, and you have to be prepared for what you might find. Over the following months, Margaret expanded her research beyond the Whitmore family. She requested death certificates from Cook County for children aged 6 to 16 who had died between 1900 and 1920 with orphanage or state ward listed as next of kin or place of residence. The county sent her a stack of over 200 records. Most were attributed to diseases common in the era: tuberculosis, typhoid, diphtheria. But a significant number listed vaguer causes: exhaustion, failure to thrive, accidental injury. Several noted that the child had been residing in a private household at the time of death. The households were rarely named. Margaret cross-referenced the death records with the orphanage's annual reports. In the years when placements increased, deaths among placed children also rose. The correlation was not perfect, but it was suggestive. Children sent to wealthy households were dying at higher rates than children who remained in the institution. She found one case that crystallized the pattern. A girl named Clara Sims, age 9, had been placed with a family on Chicago's Gold Coast in 1907. According to the orphanage report, she was being educated in domestic arts and moral refinement. In 1909, she died. The death certificate listed the cause as fall from height and noted that she had been employed as a housemaid. She was 11 years old. Employed. The word sat in the document like an accusation. Clara had not been a student, she had been a worker. And when she died, possibly from being pushed, or from exhaustion, or from an accident caused by tasks too demanding for a child, the paperwork simply recorded it as a household tragedy. Margaret compiled her findings into a preliminary report and presented it to the Lakewood Historical Society's Board of Directors. She explained the significance of the Whitmore portrait, the evidence of a systematic placement program, and the broader pattern of exploitation it represented. The response was not what she had hoped. The board chair, a retired attorney named Patricia Hendricks, listened carefully but raised concerns. "The Whitmore name is still significant in this city," she said. "Their foundation funds programs at 3 local hospitals. Their descendants sit on museum boards. If we publish this interpretation, we need to be certain of our facts." Another board member, a corporate consultant named David Liu, was more direct. This is a photograph of a tutor and a student. Everything else is inference. We could face legal action if we present speculation as history. Margaret pushed back. She explained the archival evidence, the letters, the death records. She argued that the society had an obligation to present accurate history, even when it implicated powerful families. The debate continued for 3 meetings. Some board members supported Margaret's interpretation, others worried about donor relationships and institutional reputation. A compromise was proposed. The portrait would be displayed with a neutral caption that noted ongoing research into its context, without drawing explicit conclusions. Margaret refused. She argued that neutrality was itself a choice, one that protected the powerful and silenced the exploited. If the society would not tell the full story, she would find another venue. The standoff lasted 2 months. It ended when Margaret received an unexpected email. A woman named Denise Eames Carter had seen a reference to Margaret's research in a local history newsletter. She was the great-granddaughter of Theodore Eames, and she had documents that Margaret had never seen. They met at a coffee shop in Oak Park. Denise was in her 70s, a retired social worker with a careful manner and a thick folder of papers. She explained that her family had always known about Theodore's origins. It had been a source of shame for some, a matter of quiet pride for others. Theodore had eventually left the Whitmore household in his late 20s and found work as a clerk. He married, had children, and never spoke publicly about his years as a placement child, but he had kept records. Denise opened the folder. Inside were letters Theodore had written to the orphanage superintendent in the 1920s, demanding information about other children he had known during his placement years. Most had gone unanswered, but one response, dated 1924, admitted that record-keeping during the placement era had been inadequate and that the institution could not account for the whereabouts of over 300 children placed between 1895 and 1915. 300 children unaccounted for. Denise also had a photograph. It showed Theodore as an older man, standing in front of a small church on Chicago's South Side. The caption on the back, in his own handwriting, read, "Bethel AME, where we found our names again." She explained that after leaving the Whitmores, Theodore had become involved with a network of former placement children who helped each other navigate the world outside institutional control. They shared information, provided references, and sometimes sheltered children who had run away from abusive placements. The network operated quietly, mostly through black churches and community organizations that understood what it meant to have your identity controlled by others. He spent the rest of his life trying to find the children who disappeared, Denise said. He believed some of them were still alive, working as servants in households across the city. He believed some of them had been given new names, new identities. He believed the system was designed to make them invisible, and he wanted to make them visible again. Margaret asked if she could include Theodore's story in her research. Denise agreed, on one condition: the final presentation had to center the children, not the wealthy families, not the institutions, the children. Margaret returned to the Historical Society with Denise's documents and a revised proposal. This time, she did not ask for permission. She informed the board that she was preparing a public exhibition on the history of child placement in Illinois, using the Whitmore portrait as a starting point. The exhibition would include Theodore's letters, Clara Sims's death certificate, and the orphanage's own admission that hundreds of children had vanished from their records. The board could support the exhibition or oppose it. Either way, the story would be told. 2 board members resigned in protest. Patricia Hendricks remained, though she made clear her reservations. The majority voted to proceed, partly because Margaret's research had attracted attention from journalists and academics who would cover the story regardless of the society's involvement. The exhibition opened the following spring. It occupied a single gallery, with the Whitmore portrait at its center. Beside it, a panel explained what visitors were seeing, not a celebration of education, but documentation of a system that turned vulnerable children into household property. The faint orphanage stamp was highlighted in a magnified reproduction. Theodore Eames's letters were displayed in a glass case. A timeline showed the rise and fall of the placement program and the eventual reforms that dismantled it, though not before thousands of children had passed through its machinery. On opening night, Denise Eames Carter stood before the portrait of her great-grandfather and spoke about what it meant to reclaim a history that had been hidden for a century. She read from one of Theodore's letters. They called us placements. They gave us numbers instead of names. They told us we were being saved, but we were being sold, and the receipts were called contracts, and the buyers were called benefactors, and the whole arrangement was called progress. The room was silent. In the months that followed, the exhibition attracted national attention. Historians from other states contacted Margaret with evidence of similar programs in New York, Massachusetts, and Ohio. A genealogist in Springfield began reconstructing the identities of children listed in the orphanage's surviving ledgers, matching them against death records, census data, and the occasional family memory. So far, she had identified 43 children whose fates could be documented. Most had died young. A few had survived into adulthood and started families who knew nothing of their origins. The Whitmore Foundation issued a statement acknowledging the family's participation in the placement program and announcing a donation to support research into the history of child welfare in Illinois. Some observers called it accountability. Others called it reputation management. The distinction, Margaret thought, probably depended on what happened next. She returned to the portrait often in the weeks after the exhibition opened. Each time she noticed something new. The way the light fell on the orphanage stamp, the stiffness of Harold's posture, the expression on Theodore's face, which she had initially read as professional composure, but now understood as something closer to endurance. The photograph had been taken to project an image of benevolent wealth and grateful service, a tutor and his student, a household that valued education, a child being given every advantage, but the image had also preserved evidence against itself. The stamp was still there. The letters had survived. The system had been designed to erase its victims, but some traces remained, waiting for someone to read them differently. Margaret thought about all the other photographs in all the other archives, all the portraits of wealthy families posed in their libraries and parlors with servants standing at the edges of the frame. How many of those servants had been children? How many had arrived through contracts that promised education and delivered exploitation? How many had been returned, reassigned, or simply lost in the paperwork? She did not have answers, but she had learned something about how to look. The details that seemed decorative were often evidence. The margins of the frame were where the truth survived. And the faces that looked composed, obedient, grateful, might be wearing expressions that meant something else entirely if you understood what it cost to stand there and hold still while the shutter clicked. The portrait of Theodore Eames and Harold Whitmore still hangs in the Lakewood Historical Society's permanent collection. The caption has been rewritten. It no longer celebrates education or progress. It names the system. It honors the children who passed through it. And it asks the only question that matters when looking at photographs from eras of exploitation. Not what did the camera want us to see, but who was made invisible so that image could exist. Every old portrait is an argument. It tells you who mattered and who did not. It frames some people as subjects and others as property. It presents arrangements of power as natural, inevitable, deserved. But photographs also fail. They capture more than they mean to. They preserve the evidence they were supposed to destroy. And sometimes, a century later, someone looks at the underside of a book and sees a stamp that changes everything. The children of the placement era were not saved. They were used, and the families who used them kept portraits to prove how generous they had been. Now, at least, we can see those portraits for what they are, not records of charity, records of theft, and every embossed stamp, every reused contract number, every vague entry in a death certificate is a name waiting to be spoken aloud again.